town of Milbrook, Pennsylvania, sat nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, a place where the autumn of 1817 brought more than just falling leaves. It brought whispers. Whispers of a congregation that met in darkness, far from the eyes of those who walked in daylight. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and as the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, the respectable citizens of Milbrook locked their doors and shuttered their windows, grateful for the warmth of their hearths and the security of their beliefs. But there were others in Milbrook who did not enjoy such comforts. These were the people who existed in the margins, whose lives were governed by laws they had no voice in creating, whose faith was tested not by scripture alone, but by the very act of survival. Among them was a man named Samuel Garrett, a free black man who had purchased his freedom 15 years prior with every penny he had earned working the docks of Philadelphia. He had come to Milbrook seeking a quiet life, a place where he might practice his trade as a carpenter and live without the constant threat that had haunted him in the city. Samuel was a man of few words but deep conviction. His hands, calloused and strong, had built homes for families throughout Milbrook, and his reputation for honest work had earned him a measure of respect, though never quite acceptance. He lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where the road turned to dirt and the trees grew thick enough to hide the sky. It was there, in that humble dwelling, that Samuel first heard about the underground church. The story came to him through Martha Brennan, a widow who had hired him to repair the rotting floorboards of her kitchen. Martha was an unusual woman for her time and place. She had inherited her late husband's farm and managed it herself, refusing the well-meaning offers of neighboring men who suggested she needed a husband to guide her. She spoke plainly, worked hard, and treated Samuel with a dignity that surprised him. It was on a grey October afternoon, as Samuel worked beneath her kitchen floor, that Martha knelt down and spoke to him in a voice barely above a whisper. She told him about a place where people gathered to worship in secret, a place where the prayers were not spoken aloud, but written on the walls in blood. Samuel's hammer paused mid-strike. He looked up at Martha, searching her face for signs of madness or jest, but found only solemn sincerity. Martha explained that the church existed beneath an abandoned mill on the far side of Coulter's Creek, a waterway that cut through the forest like a scar. The mill had burned years ago, its owner lost to bankruptcy and despair, and the ruins had been left to the encroachment of nature. But beneath those ruins, in chambers that had once stored grain and flour, a different kind of congregation had taken root. These were people who could not worship freely in the daylight, whose presence in the established churches of Milbrook was tolerated only in the back pews and balconies, if at all. Samuel asked Martha why she was telling him this, and her answer was simple. She had seen him reading his Bible by candlelight when she passed his cabin in the evenings. She knew he was a man of faith, and she believed he might find solace in knowing he was not alone in his spiritual hunger. But there was something else in her eyes, something that made Samuel's heart quicken. It was fear. Martha confessed that her own daughter, Rebecca, had begun attending the underground church 3 months ago. Rebecca was 18, headstrong, and filled with a passionate sense of justice that both terrified and inspired her mother. She had befriended a young enslaved woman named Celia, who belonged to the Henderson family, one of the wealthiest households in Milbrook. Celia had told Rebecca about the church, and Rebecca had insisted on seeing it for herself. Now Martha was worried. Rebecca came home with strange marks on her hands, faint traces of dried blood that she claimed were from helping Celia with chores. But Martha was not convinced. She had heard rumors about the underground church, whispers that spoke of rituals and oaths, of prayers written not with ink, but with the blood of the faithful. She did not know what to believe, but she knew her daughter was in danger. Samuel listened to every word, his mind racing with questions and concerns. He promised Martha he would look into the matter, though he did not yet know what he would find, or what he would do once he found it. The following Sunday, Samuel made his way to the town's Methodist church, a modest building with whitewashed walls and a steeple that reached hopefully toward heaven. He took his usual place in the rear gallery, where the black members of the congregation were expected to sit, separate from the white families who occupied the pews below. The sermon that morning was delivered by Reverend Josiah Klein, a thin man with a voice that carried more authority than his frame suggested. Reverend Klein spoke about obedience, about the divine order that placed each person in their proper station, about the sin of pride, and the virtue of accepting one's lot in life with grace and humility. Samuel listened, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the wooden bench beneath him. He had heard variations of this sermon many times before, and each time it left him feeling hollow, as though the God being described from that pulpit was not the same God he read about in his Bible late at night. After the service ended, Samuel lingered near the church entrance, watching as the congregation filed out into the crisp November air. He noticed Rebecca Brennan standing with a group of young women, her auburn hair pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, her expression polite but distant. She glanced in his direction, and their eyes met for the briefest moment before she looked away. There was something in that glance, a flicker of recognition or perhaps warning, that confirmed Martha's fears. Samuel decided he needed to see the underground church for himself. That evening, as darkness settled over Milbrook like a heavy blanket, he gathered his coat, a small lantern, and his Bible, and set out toward Coulter's Creek. The forest at night was a different world, filled with sounds that seemed amplified in the absence of light. Owls called to one another from distant trees, and the underbrush rustled with the movements of unseen creatures. Samuel's lantern cast dancing shadows that made the trees appear to lean in toward him, curious or perhaps hostile. He followed the creek's edge, the water moving slowly beside him, dark and secretive. After nearly an hour of walking, he came upon the ruins of the old mill. The structure was a skeleton of charred beams and crumbling stone walls, overtaken by vines and moss. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time and memory. But as Samuel approached, he noticed something that made him stop. There were footprints in the mud near the mill's foundation, fresh enough that they had not yet been erased by rain or wind. Samuel circled the ruins carefully, searching for an entrance to the underground chambers Martha had mentioned. He found it on the northern side, hidden behind a collapsed section of wall. Stone steps descended into darkness, worn smooth by years of use. Samuel hesitated at the top of those steps, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn back, to return to the safety of his cabin, and forget what Martha had told him. But something stronger than instinct drove him forward. It was the same force that had sustained him through years of bondage, the same hope that had led him to purchase his freedom and build a new life. It was faith. He descended into the earth, his lantern held high. The air grew cooler and damper with each step, carrying the smell of stone and something else, something metallic and unsettling. At the bottom of the stairs, Samuel found himself in a narrow corridor that stretched ahead into shadow. The walls were stone, slick with moisture, and the ceiling was low enough that he had to duck his head slightly as he walked. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, and what Samuel saw there stopped him in his tracks. The room was roughly circular, carved from the bedrock beneath the mill. Along the walls, illuminated by his lantern's flickering light, were hundreds of words written in a dark, rust-colored substance that Samuel immediately recognized as blood. The words formed prayers, verses from Scripture, declarations of faith and pleas for deliverance. They covered every inch of available surface, layered upon one another in different hands and different states of preservation. In the center of the chamber stood a simple wooden cross, no taller than a man, rough-hewn and unpainted. At its base were offerings, a handful of flowers now wilted, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a child's small wooden doll. Samuel moved closer, his breath shallow, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. This was not the work of madness or heresy. This was the work of desperation, of souls who had been denied the basic dignity of speaking their prayers aloud and had found another way to make themselves heard. As Samuel stood there, taking in the weight of what he had discovered, he heard a sound behind him. He turned quickly, raising his lantern, and found himself face to face with Rebecca Brennan and the young enslaved woman who could only be Celia. Rebecca held a candle in one hand, its small flame casting long shadows across her face. Celia stood beside her, a young woman with dark skin and eyes that held both wariness and determination. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence in the underground chamber was thick, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of their lights. Samuel was the first to break the silence. He asked Rebecca what this place was, though he already knew the answer. Rebecca stepped forward, her expression a mixture of defiance and relief. She told him that the underground church had been created 5 years ago by a group of enslaved people from the Henderson and Cartwright plantations, along with a few free black individuals and sympathetic white allies. They had discovered the chambers beneath the old mill by accident when seeking shelter from a storm, and they had transformed it into a sanctuary. Celia spoke next, her voice soft but steady. She explained that the established churches of Milbrook offered them nothing but judgment and segregation. They were made to sit apart, to remain silent, to accept teachings that justified their oppression as the will of God. The underground church was different. Here they could worship as equals, express their true feelings, and pray for freedom without fear of punishment. The blood writing on the walls was not part of any dark ritual, as rumors suggested. It was simply the most permanent way they had to record their prayers, using what they had available. Samuel asked why they used blood instead of ink or charcoal. Rebecca explained that ink was expensive and difficult to obtain without raising suspicion, and charcoal could be easily washed away by the moisture that seeped through the stone walls. Blood, drawn from small cuts on their fingers or palms, was readily available and created marks that lasted. Each person who came to the underground church added their own prayers to the walls, contributing to a growing testament of faith and resistance. As Samuel examined the walls more closely, he began to recognize verses from Psalms, from Exodus, from the Gospels. He saw prayers for children separated from their parents, for spouses sold away, for the strength to endure another day. He saw declarations of unwavering belief in a God who saw their suffering and would one day deliver them from bondage. The words were not written in educated, flowing script. Many were misspelled or grammatically imperfect, but their power was undeniable. Celia told Samuel that approximately 30 people knew about the underground church and attended services there. They came in small groups, never more than 5 or 6 at a time, to avoid drawing attention. They met on different nights of the week, using a system of signals to communicate when it was safe to gather. The Henderson family, Celia's owners, believed she was visiting her mother, who lived on a neighboring plantation. In reality, Celia's mother had died 2 years ago, but she had kept that information secret to maintain her freedom of movement. Samuel asked if they were not afraid of being caught, of the consequences they would face if their secret was discovered. Celia's response was immediate and fierce. She said they were already living in fear every day of their lives, fear of being sold, fear of being punished for imagined offenses, fear of watching their loved ones suffer, and being powerless to help. The underground church gave them something more valuable than safety. It gave them hope, community, and a space where their humanity was recognized and honored. Rebecca added that some white residents of Milbrook suspected something unusual was happening, which was why rumors about the underground church had begun to spread. Most dismissed these rumors as superstitious nonsense, but a few, like her mother, had genuine concerns. Rebecca had been helping Celia and others maintain the underground church by bringing supplies when she could: candles, cloth, food, and medicine. The blood marks on her hands that had worried her mother were exactly what they appeared to be, the result of adding her own prayers to the walls. Samuel realized that he was standing at a crossroads. He could walk away from the underground church, return to his quiet life, and pretend he had never seen what he had seen. Or he could become part of this secret congregation, risking his hard-won freedom for the sake of something greater than himself. He thought about the years he had spent in bondage, about the moment he had handed over his savings to purchase his freedom, about the promise he had made to himself to live with dignity and purpose. He asked Rebecca and Celia if he could return to the underground church, if he could join them in their worship. Both women studied him carefully before Rebecca nodded. She told him that anyone who came to the underground church with sincere faith was welcome, regardless of their race or status. But she also warned him that by joining them, he was accepting the risks that came with defying the social order of Milbrook. Samuel understood. He had lived his entire life defying that order simply by existing, by refusing to accept that his humanity was less valuable than anyone else's. The underground church was not a rejection of faith, but a deeper embrace of it, a commitment to worshipping God on terms that honored the truth of their experience rather than the lies of their oppression. Over the following weeks, Samuel became a regular presence at the underground church. He came on Wednesday nights, when his work schedule allowed him to slip away without arousing suspicion. Each visit revealed new layers of the community that had formed in those hidden chambers beneath the mill ruins. He met Thomas, an elderly man who had been born into slavery and had watched 3 generations of his family scattered across different plantations. He met Hannah, a young mother who brought her infant son wrapped in a blanket, praying for a future where he would know freedom. He met James, a free black man like himself, who worked as a stable hand and had a gift for leading hymns in a voice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The services in the underground church were unlike anything Samuel had experienced in the daylight churches of Milbrook. There was no rigid structure, no formal liturgy dictated by someone standing at a pulpit high above the congregation. Instead, people shared prayers, read passages from Scripture, and sang spirituals that had been passed down through generations. The songs were often coded messages, containing hidden meanings about escape routes and safe houses, about endurance and liberation. Samuel learned to listen for the layers beneath the lyrics, to understand that when they sang about crossing rivers and following stars, they were speaking of the Underground Railroad that ran north toward freedom. One Wednesday in late November, as Samuel descended the stone steps into the underground church, he found the atmosphere different from usual. The chamber was more crowded than he had ever seen it, with perhaps 15 people gathered around the wooden cross at the center. Their faces were tense and several were whispering urgently to one another. Rebecca stood near the entrance, and when she saw Samuel, she moved quickly to his side. She told him that something had happened, something that threatened the underground church's existence. 2 nights earlier, a man named Jacob, an enslaved person from the Cartwright plantation, had been caught trying to teach other enslaved people to read using verses from the Bible. The Cartwright family had punished him severely and had begun asking questions about where Jacob had learned to read and who had been helping him. Jacob had not revealed anything about the underground church, but his interrogation had made everyone nervous. Samuel asked what they planned to do. Rebecca said the group was divided. Some wanted to stop meeting for a while, to let suspicion die down. Others argued that stopping would mean allowing fear to win, that the underground church was too important to abandon. Celia believed they should continue but increase their caution, perhaps meeting less frequently and in smaller groups. The debate had been ongoing for over an hour, and no consensus had been reached. Samuel listened to the various arguments being presented. He heard the fear in their voices, but he also heard something stronger: determination. These people had created something sacred in the darkness beneath Milbrook, something that gave them strength to face the cruelties of their daily lives. To abandon it would be to surrender a piece of their humanity, and none of them were willing to do that easily. Thomas, the elderly man Samuel had met on his first visit, stood with effort and addressed the group. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of his years. He reminded them that their ancestors had worshipped in secret for as long as any of them could remember, that the need to hide their faith was not new but a burden that had been passed down through generations. He said that every generation faced the choice of whether to continue or to give in to fear, and every time their ancestors had chosen to continue, to find new ways to keep their faith alive. Thomas suggested that they view the current threat not as a reason to stop but as a challenge to adapt. Perhaps they could create additional meeting places so that if one was discovered, others would remain safe. Perhaps they could develop better warning systems to alert members if someone was being followed or if danger was near. The underground church had survived for 5 years because its members had been resourceful and committed, and those qualities would see them through this crisis as well. His words seemed to shift the mood in the chamber. The tension did not disappear, but it transformed into something more purposeful. The group began discussing practical measures they could take to protect themselves and their sanctuary. Samuel found himself contributing ideas, drawing on his knowledge of Milbrook's geography and his experience moving through the town unseen. He suggested alternative routes to the mill ruins, places where lookouts could be posted, and ways to disguise the footprints that led to the hidden entrance. As the meeting continued, Samuel realized that he had found something he had been searching for since gaining his freedom, a community of people who understood his struggles and shared his hopes. The underground church was more than a place of worship. It was a testament to the resilience of people who refused to let their spirits be crushed, who found ways to assert their dignity and humanity even in the most oppressive circumstances. The blood-written prayers on the walls were not signs of desperation, but of defiance, a declaration that their voices would be heard, if not in the world above, then in the sacred space they had created below. December arrived with a bitter cold that seeped through even the thickest coats and made the walk to the underground church more treacherous. Ice formed along the edges of Coulter's Creek, and the forest paths became slippery with frozen mud. Despite the harsh conditions, attendance at the underground church remained steady. If anything, the threat that had emerged with Jacob's interrogation seemed to have strengthened the community's resolve rather than weakened it. Samuel had taken on additional responsibilities within the group. His carpentry skills proved valuable when structural repairs were needed in the underground chambers, and his ability to read and write made him useful in other ways as well. He began helping those who could not read to memorize Bible passages, working with them during quiet moments at the church, or occasionally in his cabin when it was safe to do so. One evening, as Samuel was reinforcing a section of the chamber ceiling that had begun to show signs of instability, Celia approached him with a request. She wanted him to teach her to read. She explained that she had learned the alphabet from Rebecca, but had made little progress beyond that. The risk of being caught with reading materials made learning difficult, and she needed someone patient enough to work with her slowly and carefully. Samuel agreed without hesitation. He understood the danger Celia was placing herself in by seeking literacy. In many parts of the country, teaching enslaved people to read was illegal, punishable by fines or even imprisonment for the teacher, and severe punishment for the student. But he also understood that literacy was a form of freedom, a way to access knowledge and ideas that could never be fully controlled by those who claimed ownership over human beings. They began their lessons in the underground church, using the blood-written prayers on the walls as their textbook. Celia would trace the letters with her finger, sounding out words while Samuel corrected her pronunciation and explained meanings. Progress was slow but steady. Within a few weeks, Celia could read simple passages, and her confidence grew with each session. Hannah, the young mother Samuel had met during his first visits to the underground church, often brought her infant son to these gatherings. The child, whom she called Benjamin, was remarkably quiet during services, as though he understood the need for discretion even at such a tender age. Hannah told Samuel that Benjamin's father had been sold away before the child was born, sent to a plantation in Georgia to settle a debt. She had no way of knowing if her husband was still alive or if she would ever see him again. The pain in Hannah's voice when she spoke of this separation was almost unbearable to witness. Samuel found himself thinking about her story long after their conversations ended, imagining the anguish of being torn from someone you loved with no possibility of reunion, no chance to say goodbye. The underground church provided Hannah with a space to grieve openly, to express emotions that she had to suppress in her daily life under the watchful eyes of her owners. James, the man with the powerful singing voice, had also become a close friend to Samuel. James had a gift for finding hope in the darkest circumstances, for lifting spirits even when situations seemed hopeless. His hymns in the underground church were legendary among the members, and people often requested specific songs that held particular meaning for them. James would lead them in singing, his voice filling the chamber and seeming to push back against the weight of the earth above them. Through these relationships, Samuel began to understand that the underground church was not just a place of worship, but a complete community. It was where people celebrated small victories, mourned losses, shared what little they had, and reminded one another that their worth was not determined by the society that oppressed them. The blood-written prayers on the walls were a collective testimony, each word representing a moment when someone had chosen to assert their humanity and faith despite all efforts to deny both. As winter deepened, the tensions that had arisen after Jacob's interrogation began to ease slightly. The Cartwright family seemed to have concluded their investigation without discovering the underground church, though Jacob himself had paid a terrible price for his defiance. Word spread through the community that he had been sold to a plantation owner in Alabama, effectively exiled from everyone and everything he had known. The news of Jacob's fate affected everyone who gathered in the underground church. It was a stark reminder of the power held over their lives, of how quickly everything could be taken away. At the next gathering, Thomas led a prayer for Jacob, asking God to watch over him in his new circumstances and to give him strength to endure. The prayer was written on the wall in letters larger than usual, as though sighs could somehow amplify its reach across the miles that now separated them from their friend. Samuel noticed that Rebekah had become quieter in recent weeks. The usual energy and determination in her demeanor had been replaced by something more subdued, almost fearful. One evening, after most of the others had left the underground church, Samuel asked her if something was wrong. Rebekah hesitated before answering, looking around the chamber as though checking for eavesdroppers, even though they were essentially alone. She told Samuel that her mother, Martha, had been asking more questions about where she went at night. Martha had always been supportive, even protective, of Rebekah's involvement with the underground church, but recently her concern had shifted to alarm. There had been talk in town, whispers about suspicious activities near the old mill. Someone had noticed the footprints, the signs of regular traffic, to what was supposed to be an abandoned ruin. Martha feared that it was only a matter of time before someone investigated more thoroughly. Rebekah was torn between her commitment to the underground church and her love for her mother. She did not want to cause Martha distress, but she also could not bring herself to abandon the community she had helped to nurture. The underground church had given her a sense of purpose and had opened her eyes to injustices she had been raised to ignore or accept. She had formed friendships there that meant everything to her, particularly her bond with Celia. Samuel listened carefully before offering his thoughts. He told Rebekah that her mother's fears were not unfounded, that the risk they all faced was real and growing. But he also reminded her that some things were worth the risk, that there came a point in every person's life when they had to decide what they stood for and what they were willing to sacrifice for those beliefs. He could not make that decision for Rebekah, but he could assure her that whatever she chose, she would not be judged by those who knew her heart. Rebekah's eyes filled with tears as she thanked Samuel for his words. She said she had no intention of leaving the underground church, but she needed to find a way to ease her mother's worries without revealing details that might put everyone at risk. Perhaps if Martha understood more about what they were doing and why it mattered, she would find peace with the situation. The conversation with Rebekah stayed with Samuel for days. He realized that everyone connected to the underground church was making sacrifices, taking risks that could have devastating consequences. For the enslaved members, discovery could mean brutal punishment or sale. For free black individuals like himself, it could mean losing their freedom or even their lives. For white allies like Rebekah and her mother, it could mean social ostracism or legal prosecution. Yet despite these dangers, the underground church continued to thrive. New members were cautiously welcomed after being vouched for by existing members, the walls filled with more prayers, more testimonies of faith and hope. The wooden cross at the center of the chamber became adorned with small tokens that people left as offerings: a flower, a piece of ribbon, a smooth stone from the creek. Samuel began to see the underground church as something that would outlast all of them, a legacy of resistance and faith that would endure. January of 1818 brought heavy snowfall to Milbrook, transforming the landscape into a white expanse that made travel difficult and surveillance easier. Footprints in fresh snow were impossible to hide, and the members of the underground church had to be more careful than ever about their movements. They developed new strategies, walking in each other's footprints to create the illusion of fewer people, or waiting for new snowfall to cover their tracks before leaving the underground chambers. Samuel found himself thinking more deeply about the future of the underground church and the people who depended on it. He wondered how long they could maintain their secret, how long before someone with authority decided to investigate the old mill thoroughly. He wondered what would happen to people like Celia and Hannah and James if their sanctuary was discovered and destroyed. These concerns led Samuel to propose an idea at the next gathering. He suggested they begin documenting their stories, creating a written record of who they were and what the underground church meant to them. This record would not be written in blood on the walls, but on paper that could be hidden and preserved, something that might survive even if they did not. The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some members worried that written records would be dangerous, providing evidence that could be used against them if discovered. Others argued that their stories deserved to be told, that future generations should know about the faith and courage of those who had gathered in these chambers. After considerable discussion, they reached a compromise. Those who wished to share their stories could do so, and Samuel would keep the writings hidden in a secure location in his cabin. Over the following weeks, several members of the underground church came to Samuel with their testimonies. Thomas dictated his life story, speaking of parents he had never known and children he had watched grow up only to be sold away. Hannah wrote about her husband and her hopes that Benjamin would grow up in a world different from the one she had known. Celia, still learning to write, composed a simple but powerful statement about her determination to be free whatever the cost. Rebecca contributed her own testimony, explaining how the underground church had changed her understanding of faith and justice. She wrote about the contradiction of sitting in the Methodist church on Sunday mornings, listening to sermons about Christian duty, and then coming to the underground church on Wednesday nights and seeing what true Christianity looked like when practiced by people who had every reason to abandon faith but held on to it with fierce determination. James wrote out the lyrics to some of the spirituals he had learned from his grandmother, along with explanations of their hidden meanings. He included notes about which songs were used to signal danger and which were used to provide directions for those seeking escape. His contribution was perhaps the most practical of all the testimonies, a guide that could potentially help others in the future. As Samuel collected these writings, he was struck by the diversity of experiences and perspectives they represented. The underground church had brought together people who might never have met otherwise, who came from different backgrounds and circumstances, but shared a common need for a place where they could worship freely and be treated as fully human. The act of documenting these stories also seemed to have a profound effect on those who participated. It gave them a sense that their lives mattered, that their experiences were significant enough to be recorded and remembered. For people who had been treated as property, as less than human, this affirmation of their worth was deeply meaningful. Samuel carefully stored the testimonies in a wooden box that he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his cabin. He knew the risk he was taking by maintaining this archive, but he also believed it was important. By late February, the winter's grip on Milbrook began to loosen. The snow melted into muddy streams, and the first hints of spring appeared in the form of small green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. With the changing season came a renewed sense of both hope and vulnerability for the members of the underground church. The easier weather would make travel to the mill less arduous, but it would also make their movements more visible to anyone who might be watching. It was during this transitional time that the crisis everyone had feared finally arrived. A local merchant named Edgar Whitfield had been walking near Coulter's Creek one evening when he noticed light coming from the vicinity of the old mill ruins. Curious and suspicious, he had moved closer and heard the sound of voices singing hymns beneath the ground. Whitfield had not investigated further that night, but he had reported what he had seen and heard to several prominent citizens of Milbrook. The news spread quickly through the network of people connected to the underground church. Rebecca heard about it from her mother, who had been told by a neighbor. Celia learned of it from another enslaved woman who worked in a household where Whitfield had been a dinner guest. Within 2 days of Whitfield's discovery, everyone who attended the underground church knew that their secret was no longer secret. An emergency meeting was called, the largest gathering the underground church had ever held. Nearly all 30 members crowded into the chamber, their faces reflecting fear, anger, and determination in varying degrees. The question before them was simple but agonizing. What should they do now? Some argued for immediate abandonment of the site, suggesting they find a new location and start over. Others insisted they should continue meeting at the mill, refusing to be driven away by someone like Whitfield. A few proposed that they should stop gathering altogether for a time, allowing the attention to die down before resuming their activities. The debate grew heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring as the stress of the situation overwhelmed usual restraint. Samuel listened to all sides before speaking. He reminded the group that the underground church had never been about the physical location, but about the community and the faith they shared. The chambers beneath the mill had served them well, but they were not irreplaceable. What mattered was preserving the bonds they had formed and finding ways to continue supporting one another, even if they could no longer gather in this specific place. His words seemed to calm the room somewhat, and gradually a plan began to emerge. They would not abandon the underground church entirely, but they would meet less frequently and in smaller groups. They would also begin exploring alternative locations for gatherings, so they would have options if the mill became too dangerous to use. Most importantly, they would strengthen their connections outside of formal meetings, finding ways to maintain their community even when they could not all be together. Celia made a suggestion that surprised everyone. She proposed that before they changed their pattern of meetings, they should have one final large gathering at the underground church, a service of gratitude for what the place had meant to them. If they were going to face persecution, she argued, they should face it on their own terms, not by slinking away in defeat, but by affirming their faith one last time in the space that had nurtured it. The suggestion was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it resonated with many in the group. After more discussion, they agreed to hold one more service at the underground church on the following Wednesday evening. They would invite everyone who had ever been part of the community, making it a true celebration of everything they had built together. Whatever happened after that, they would face as a unified community strengthened by their shared experience and unwavering faith. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.